HighBridge, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Kingdom of Rye, A Brief History of Russian Food by Darra Goldstein. Read by Suzanne Toren. If the rye ripens, it's a good year. Russian saying. What I wouldn't give for a piece of black bread. Alexander Pushkin, A Journey to Erzurum, 1835. Preface. In my family, Russia was a place to escape from. My grandparents had fled in the early 20th century, I never knew exactly when, and they refused to share stories of their past. So the country loomed large in my imagination. I tasted it in my grandmother's beet kvass, in her sorrel soup, in her stuffed cabbage. In college, I decided to study Russian to learn more about this beguiling place. In those days, we weren't taught oral proficiency. We entered the language through grammar and literature. I struggled through texts that refused to yield their meaning. Then suddenly, I'd happen upon a passage describing food, and the language would magically open up to me. These passages occurred surprisingly often. I absorbed the sentences first as sensations, even before I understood the actual words. Only after I'd figuratively savored the dishes did I look up the unfamiliar words in the dictionary to memorize their exact meaning. One literary meal led to another. My language skills improved, and I longed to visit Russia. The mere thought of my traveling there horrified my grandmother. But in 1972, I went nonetheless. My first breath of Soviet air immediately dispelled any romance. The place smelled of overcooked cabbage. The gray food I encountered matched the dingy surroundings. This wasn't the French-inflected haute cuisine I had encountered in 19th century literature, nor was it the rustic food of the peasantry. This was Soviet food, in an era when few ingredients were available. On that first visit, I didn't taste the famous fish pie, kulebyaka, so erotically described by Chekhov, or the plump pancakes known as blini that Gogol's hero Chichikov downs 3 at a time after dipping them in melted butter. But I thrilled to the flavors of coriander-studded rye bread, to open-faced buns filled with sweetened farmer's cheese, to Siberian dumplings laced with vinegar and mustard, to half-sour cucumbers and golden, brined cloudberries. Only later, after I broke through the surface and the rules about what foreigners could and could not do, did I finally begin to experience all the vibrant flavors of Russia. Once I got to graduate school, I intended to write my dissertation on food in Russian literature. But I was ahead of the times. In 1974, hardly anyone in American academia took food seriously. Certainly not my Stanford professors, who maintained I would have no future with such a trivial pursuit. So I focused instead on Russian modernist poetry, which I don't regret. But I never abandoned my subversive idea of writing about Russian food. As I studied for my qualifying exams, I jotted down every reference to food I encountered over 2 centuries of Russian literature. Many of these quotations eventually found their way into my first cookbook, À la Russe, a cookbook of Russian hospitality, which came out in September 1983, just as I started teaching Russian literature at Williams College. The book may have begun as a metaphorical thumbing of my nose at the stuffy attitudes of my professors, but it became a response to the year when I'd taken a break from grad school, working instead for the United States Information Agency in Russia. I served as a guide for the exhibition Agriculture USA, an outcome of the 1958 cultural agreement between the U.S. and the USSR. The exhibition's presentation of American agricultural bounty was not apolitical. It was a finger in the eye to a country suffering severe food shortages, heightened by the Cold War. I had a fleeting but nasty encounter with the KGB, made worse by a debriefing by U.S. State Department security, and by the end of my 10-month stint, I was ready to give up Russian studies. No matter that I'd already invested so much. But something pulled me back, and that something was Russian hospitality. Ordinary people asked me to dinner. We crowded around tiny tables, eating with mismatched plates and forks in tiny rudimentary kitchens, and the food was delicious. My pursuit of things Russian was saved by the generosity of all the people who opened their homes to me, often at considerable risk, to share whatever they could put together from the scarce resources at hand. My book was my thank-you note. Over the years, as I traveled throughout the Soviet Union and then Russia, my interest in Russian food only deepened. I was still working in archives, researching Russian poetry, but my real aim was to understand Russian food culture, the origins of dishes, the role of the traditional Russian stove, the superstitions surrounding preparation, the influence of the Orthodox Church, gender roles in the kitchen, etiquette at the table, the introduction of foodstuffs from East and West, and how Russians adapted them to their own taste. It was a pleasure and a passion to uncover Russia's most elemental flavors, the ones that stretch back over 1,000 years, to try to define the basics of the cuisine. My research eventually took me to tiny villages in the Russian north, where cooks still prepare food in masonry stoves, and each year put up liters of foraged and cultivated fruits and berries for the unrelenting winter ahead. I described these foods in my most recent cookbook, Beyond the North Wind, Russia in Recipes and Lore, which appeared in 2020. The book you are currently listening to is its more historical and ethnographic sibling. Tracing Russian culinary culture from its pre-Christian beginnings up to the present day, The Kingdom of Rye represents a culmination of my lifetime of thinking about Russia and the marvels of its food. And at a time when tensions once again divide Russia and the West, cultural understanding becomes all the more crucial. A note on transliteration and translation. Throughout the book, I have used the modified Library of Congress system. Unless otherwise noted, all translations are mine. Introduction. 19th century Russia was overflowing with gingerbread. Gingerbread in all shapes and sizes, figured, sculpted, and stamped. If we're to believe the authors of an 1838 guidebook, the town of Gorodets alone produced a staggering 360,000 pounds of gingerbread each year. Gingerbreads, pryaniki, were highly localized, with numerous cities and towns laying claim to the very best. Vyazma pryaniki were bite-sized, the dough so sticky with honey that it had to be pounded with wooden mallets and tempered for days, sometimes weeks, until it reached the right consistency for baking. The honey provided flavor, of course, but it also kept the cookies moist for months. Connoisseurs knew not to bite down on them, but to let each cookie melt in the mouth to release the honey's taste. Supersized gingerbreads from Gorodets were baked in large loaves embossed with designs made by pressing the dough into carved wooden boards. These pryaniki could be 6 feet in length and weigh up to 36 pounds. So famous was the gingerbread baked in Tver that it was exhibited at the 1876 Philadelphia Centennial International Exposition, where it appeared alongside inventions by Alexander Graham Bell and Albert Einstein. This gingerbread won a bronze medal for its many varieties and the originality of its designs. Russian gingerbread started out simply as a mixture of rye flour, honey, and berry juice that was left to ferment for a few days before baking. Because honey accounted for almost half of the mixture, the cakes were known as honey bread, until spices were added some centuries later. Increasingly, bakers used gingerbread as a medium to display their artistry. The earliest gingerbread, molded into symbolic three-dimensional shapes, gave way to decorated rectangular loaves. The gingerbread boards used to press patterns into the dough became an important expression of Russian folk art, one that reflected evolving trends in subject matter, from familiar creatures like roosters and sturgeon to complex narrative scenes scored into individual squares that could be broken off. The most extravagant pryaniki were decorated with gold leaf. This progression from simple to excessive, turning the mundane into the fanciful, can be seen as typically Russian. That bakers would lavish so much effort on a food unnecessary for survival is a telling example of the way in which traditional Russian culinary culture responds to hardship, to a harsh climate, repressive regimes, and austere religious strictures, punctuating frugality with flashes of extravagance. Most of the Russian populace lived their lives on the edge, teetering towards hunger, and dependent on an annual harvest that could be destroyed by untimely frosts, drought, hail, insects, or commissars. During Tsarist times, the peasants' lack of capital meant that they couldn't buy food when their own crops failed, even though grain and bread might be in abundance nearby. In Soviet times, food often rotted in the fields for lack of spare parts for harvesting machinery, or arrived at its destination spoiled because of unreliable distribution systems. Russia has endured far more than its share of famines. In the 20th century, the worst periods of hunger, the Volga famine of 1921–22 during Russia's Civil War, the brutal collectivization campaign in 1932–33, and the siege of Leningrad during World War II, were caused not by natural forces, but by social upheaval and cynical political determinations. Even in years unmarked by particular calamity, Russian peasants went hungry, or at least went without, and scarcity became the mother of their inventiveness. While ever mindful of the dark historical record, this book celebrates the Russian people's ingenuity in dealing with hardship and the gustatory delight that can emerge from privation. Adversity, for Russians, has given rise to a remarkably vibrant repertoire of foods. When I experience the pungency of garlic and horseradish, the intensity of lacto-fermented vegetables and fruits, the sour tang of black bread and the hearty bite of whole grains, the woodsy flavor of mushrooms and the dusky notes of cloudberries, I am reminded of the Russian ability to preserve and to persevere. These are the flavors of the land, transformed through fermentation, slow cooking, culturing, and baking into dishes that are greater than their individual parts. If deprived English speakers live from hand to mouth, Russians live from bread to kvass, kvass being a fermented beverage made from stale rye bread. Bread, the mainstay of the diet, was considered sacred even into modern times, and none ever went to waste. It was dried and fermented into effervescent kvass, or layered as breadcrumbs in a pudding with pureed apples and a little honey. A sought-after confection known as Kaluga dough for its town of origin was made by simmering stale breadcrumbs in spiced honey syrup. Oats weren't just boiled into porridge. They were dried and roasted and pounded into a flour called talakno that imparts a nutty flavor to pancakes and dairy dishes, Or they were soaked to produce oat milk, more than 1,000 years before it became trendy in Brooklyn. Buckwheat groats were mixed with sautéed chanterelles and onions, then garnished with brined lingonberries in an early Russian version of a grain bowl. Even though the Russian table has been enriched by the introduction of new foodstuffs from both East and West, the flavors that typify the Russian palate have remained surprisingly constant. The tang of cultured dairy products, like sour cream and yogurt-like prostokvasha, the bite of strong mustard and horseradish, the zing of fermented cucumbers and cabbage. If we think in terms of the anthropologist Sidney Mintz's core fringe hypothesis, which holds that a culinary culture's core, usually a bland, complex carbohydrate, is enlivened by bold accompaniments that constitute its fringe, we can see the inventiveness of ordinary Russians who elevate core staples of Russian cuisine, like rye, buckwheat, and oats, with fringe complements of fermented and cultured foods. These additions add piquancy to starches, while also providing necessary nutrients, often in the form of the probiotics we like to tout today. Frequent famines helped to induce a certain fatalism among the Russian people, which, in a cruel irony, made hunger easier to endure. If the gods will it, our bellies will be full. If not, we'll manage somehow. After Russia accepted Christianity in 988, the Russian Orthodox Church shrewdly turned privation into a virtue by designating nearly 200 days a year as fast days. Prolonged fasts coincided with the agricultural seasons of greatest scarcity. But the Russian Orthodox calendar also evinced awareness of human nature. The stringent fasts were punctuated by feast days, so that there was always something to look forward to. On these feast days, a cook might bake a sumptuous pie, or some gingerbread, or simmer a soup with a little meat. For most of the year, though, the peasantry awaited relief, or else dreamed of the skatyert samobranka, the self-spreading tablecloth of Russian fairy tales. Such culinary utopias were common throughout medieval Europe, the most famous being the land of Cockaigne, but Russia's version was, in a way, more immediate. If you could just get your hands on the magical tablecloth and unfold it, lavish delicacies would instantly appear. Dreams of cornucopia weren't just a thing of fairy tales and the past. Well into the late 20th century, the Soviet government trumpeted abundance to create an illusion of material well-being. Shop windows featured artfully arranged displays of canned goods that concealed the empty shelves inside. Moscow's handful of fancy restaurants triumphantly presented diners with oversized, leather-bound menus listing dozens of dishes when only a handful were ever available from the kitchen. The nightly news broadcasts ended with images of plentiful harvests playing across the screen, with wheat pouring through hoppers like waterfalls of golden grain. No matter that the government was often forced to import wheat from its political enemies to make sure there would be enough cattle fodder and bread. Foodstuffs randomly appeared and disappeared, and shopping took real talent. Even when virtually nothing seemed to be available, almost everything could be had if you knew how to obtain it. And obtain it people did, putting together some of the most elaborate meals I've ever enjoyed, food shortages being a catalyst for creativity. My introduction to the Russian table came through reading the alluring descriptions of food in Russian literature. Nikolai Gogol's four-cornered pie, so luscious it could make a dead man's mouth water. Chekhov's kulebyaka, a layered fish pie that's appetizing, shameless in its nakedness, a temptation to sin. These enticements and others made me long to visit Russia, to taste its grand dishes. But when I finally got there, during the Cold War, I was shocked by the food deficits and indifferent cooking that defined Soviet reality. I tried to reconcile the delicacies I'd savored in my imagination with the everyday fare that sustained me, like stolichny salat, a pyramid-shaped potato, chicken, and vegetable salad dripping with mayonnaise. That near-daily salad, one of the few constants on Soviet menus, proved both a comfort and an unexpected rabbit hole. Little did I know at first bite that this capital salad was a bastardized version of the elegant salade Olivier first introduced to fashionable Muscovites in the 1860s. Nor did I realize that behind each bowl of borscht, each spurt of butter from artfully prepared chicken Kiev, lay a hidden and often complex history. Culinary practices are as dynamic as languages, continually changing in relation to the social context in which they are performed. New foods are introduced, old dishes fall out of favor. Kitchen technologies change as new dietary trends emerge. Thus, the idea of a stable national cuisine can seem contrived. But, as with languages, we can trace words back to roots. We can identify representative ingredients and a unique grammar of techniques, or marked philosophies of dining, or certain distinctive flavor profiles that typify a cuisine. It is tempting to tell the culinary story of Russia in terms of dualities and easy juxtapositions, scarcity and abundance, feasting and fasting, poverty and wealth, restraint and excess, modesty and flamboyance. And such pairings can reveal a lot about social structures and about the way food is consumed. But they can't begin to communicate what is, to me, most crucial: food's taste and texture, the technologies of preparation, the aesthetics of the table, and, perhaps above all, its cultural resonance and the emotional value of traditional flavors. How people know who they are by what they eat together. Writing about food calls for an appreciation of food's sensory qualities. Whether it's the heady fragrance of Antonov apples in autumn, or the visceral smell of pig's feet simmering into the meat aspic called studень. What equivalencies are there between an aristocratic table laden with flowers and shimmering with candles à la Russe, and a peasant family's rough board upon which a communal pot of wild mushroom and barley soup has been set? Where but in Russian literature can you find that 19th-century prototype, the superfluous man, bemoaning the emptiness of life even as he reaches for another piece of pie, as if for the embodiment of truth? And who is to say that the superfluous man isn't right to find truth materialized in sensory delight? This domestic history of Russian food offers a look into people's daily lives, to serve up a history that originates from the wooden spoon rather than from the scepter. 1. The land and its flavors. The old man crumbled some bread into his cup, mashed it with the stem of his spoon, poured on some water from his whetstone case, sliced some more bread, and after sprinkling it with salt, turned to the east to pray. Lev Tolstoy, Anna Karenina. At the heart of any traditional Russian meal lies black bread, a loaf of dense sourdough rye. The old man's simple dinner described by Tolstoy is a dish known as turia, which consists of breadcrumbs usually soaked in kvass, a fermented beverage made from rye bread. Churia is essentially bread on bread, sometimes with a little onion added for flavor. So ingrained was rye in the Russian diet that by the late 19th century, 30 to 60% of the country's arable land was annually planted in this crop, leading to a veritable Kingdom of Rye. The peasants expressed reverence for their rye bread by holding the loaf close to the chest and slicing it horizontally toward the heart. Wasting breadcrumbs was considered a sin, and even into the late 20th century, entire cookbooks were devoted to using leftover black bread. Rye bread is highly nutritious and slow to digest, and therefore good for keeping hunger at bay. More than a nutrient, bread is also a sacrament. That the old man in Anna Karenina says a prayer before his meal isn't surprising, as most Russian peasants were devout Orthodox Christians. But the fact that he turns to the East reveals something more about the Russians and their world. Early Slavs envisioned the sun as the eye through which God looked at the world. And even after the advent of Christianity, they continued the act of devotion. In a holdover from pagan times, the old man faces the direction of the rising sun, as if asking the sun god, Dazhbok, for a blessing. And to this day, Russians make blini, their beloved pancakes, golden and round in the image of the sun, as they did over 1,000 years ago when they baked them on hot stones at the vernal equinox to coax the sun to return after a long, dark winter. By following tradition, they pay homage, even if they no longer consciously connect the round pancakes with the god of the sun. The numerous gods and spirits that ruled the early Slavic world were not always benign. For Russians, nature is not just landscape or backdrop. It is a vital, often unpredictable, force. A forest lyeshi could withhold prey from hunters. The spirits of trees felled for timber lived on in cottage walls. House and barn spirits protected families or wreaked havoc at will, ensuring well-being or fomenting disaster. Even today, Russians frequent foraging for nature's gifts. The mushrooms, berries, and wild herbs gathered from forest, meadow, and swamp reflects a spiritual need, a deep-seated urge not just to be outdoors, but to become one with nature, breathing in what Vladimir Nabokov describes in Speak Memory as the special boletic reek which makes a Russian's nostrils dilate, a dark, dank, satisfying blend of damp moss, rich earth, rotting leaves. Staple foods. Russia straddles 2 continents and constitutes about 1/7 of the Earth's entire landmass. Any overview of the country's cuisine necessarily elides the vast ecological differences in the country's various regions. In central Russia, the great swath of Chernozem, extraordinarily fertile soil stretching into the Eurasian steppes, allows for productive agriculture, especially the cultivation of grains. To the south, the temperate climate enables the growing of heat-loving crops like eggplant and wine grapes. The diet in the north is more limited, with a greater reliance on fish and hearty grains. But it is still possible to identify a spectrum of flavors and taste preferences that characterize the Russian table. Russia's north is home to the taiga, vast boreal forests where travelers once reported great pools and lakes of honey in hives swarming with wild bees. Honey is Russia's age-old sweetener, originally mixed with rye flour and berry juice to make ginger.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?